Filippo Dionigi is a senior lecturer of politics and international relations at the University of Bristol and joins me now live from there. Filippo, thanks for taking the time to speak to us. It's been just over 10 weeks now since the start of the war. It seems, though, that in the past few days at least, international pressure seems to be growing on Benjamin Netanyahu. Would you agree? And could that push the government to change its tactics in the war against Hamas?
Look, I think it's a very complex situation. I mean, as you were saying, we are 10 weeks into this conflict. And let's say that Israel had 5 objectives to achieve with this war. The first one is eradicating Hamas. The second is the liberation of the 130 hostages that are left in Gaza. The third one is the restoration of security in the areas that neighbors Gaza, but also on the northern border with Lebanon, where the situation is increasingly fragile and serious in that respect too. A fourth undeclared objective was possibly making Gaza a place that is unlivable and possibly even remove the Palestinian population from that area. And a fifth undeclared objective is the political survival of Netanyahu itself. I don't see personally, if you think of it, the realization of at least the first 4 objectives. Forget about the fifth one for a minute, which it means that this war is increasingly, day by day, becoming less and less justifiable for Israel itself, right? Which is why probably we see an increasing pressure coming also from Israel allies. Yesterday, we saw a joint declaration from the Foreign Ministry of the UK and the Foreign Minister of Germany that are basically calling for the conditions to establish a sustainable ceasefire. It's a belated request at this point, but it marks a significant turn in the type of pressure that Israel allies are putting on Israel itself and on Netanyahu. As you were saying also last week, we saw President Biden, in fact, saying that Israel's bombardments of Gaza were were indiscriminate, in fact, which is tantamount an indirect accusation of the breach of the law of wars, in fact. Next week, the U.S. Defense Secretary of Defense is due to visit Israel. And yesterday, the France Foreign Minister Colonna was actually visiting Israel and then moved on with a visit to Lebanon. So in reality, diplomacy seems to be moving, and time pressure is becoming possibly the worst enemy for Netanyahu at this point. The real question is, will Netanyahu really hear to these requests or not? It's something that probably we will need to wait and see for having, this answer.
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there. So let's just kind of take those things one by one. Let's start with that ceasefire vote that could happen today at the UN. Do you think the U.S. will finally either abstain or vote yes to that ceasefire? And if so, what exactly will be behind this change of heart? Will it be this criticism of the indiscriminate bombing like you were mentioning a moment ago?
Well, look, the bombing that we saw, in generally the military operation that we saw on Gaza is ferocious. And 40% of the bombs that have been dropped on Gaza are in fact so-called dumb bombs, so bombs that are non-GPS guided. And they were dropped on one of the areas of the world that is most densely populated, which is why civilian casualties were so high. They are counted up until now as 18,000 by the Gazan authorities themselves. So in reality, I mean, is this sustainable and for how long? Consider that also public opinion has been mobilized seriously and has moved the worst possible accusations against Israel. Israel has been accused of breaching the laws of war, but also of the most egregious crimes against humanity, genocide, in fact. So obviously, this is something that is not sustainable in the long term, especially if you think that this war is not really delivering what it's supposed to deliver so far. The hostages are still there, and the killing of the 3 hostages on Friday by the Israeli army has worsened this situation even further and has put even greater pressure on the domestic level on Netanyahu to address this situation more meaningfully. It's difficult to answer your question whether the U.S. at this point will abstain or will vote in favor of the ceasefire. I think it's extremely unlikely that we'll vote in favor. But at this point also, another consideration is in place. Exactly, even assuming that the UN Security Council will approve a call for a ceasefire, what are going to be the consequences on the ground for this? Will actually Israel abide to this or not? It will be a symbolic and very formal move. It will mark a turn, but the reality on the ground may not be necessarily affected in the short term. And also, as I was mentioning before, I'm slightly concerned about what's happening on the northern border between Israel and Lebanon, which may be the sort of follow-up situation for this conflict where we will need to consider, in fact.
Indeed. And what's interesting is you mentioned at the beginning these five pillars, the fifth pillar being Netanyahu and his future himself. A recent poll shows that the majority of Israelis actually hold Benjamin Netanyahu accountable for what's happening now. Do you think that this war will mark the downfall of Benjamin Netanyahu?
It's hard to say. One of the reasons why he has been so determined and so aggressive in its policy towards Gaza is possibly explained by the fact that this war is a war for survival politically for him as well, right? So if any of the objectives that they have established for this war will be achieved, then he might be able to claim a victory, quote unquote, for this war. But the reality, as I was trying to say at the beginning, is none of these objectives is in fact seem to be in reach for the time being. It has not been achieved to any meaningful extent for the time being. So it's hard time for Prime Minister Netanyahu, as far as I can see.
Filippo, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. That's Filippo Dionigi at the University of Bristol. Thank you.